I am a director here with the Martech Group. I've been with Martech for going on 20 years now. I have done dozens of different conjoint projects. Martech is a market research firm with experience in both business-to-business and business-to-consumer research. We've been in business for 35 years. During our webinar today, we're going to go through four main topics. We're going to talk about conjoint writ large, and talk about the different types of conjoint, kind of a timeline of how conjoint evolved over the years. And then we'll go in depth on three different types, the most frequently used types of conjoint, including MacDiff, which, although not a true conjoint analysis, can be used for some of the same prioritization type of questions. So to look at conjoint, when this first started out, conjoint was almost exclusively used for products only. There were very few other applications that were explored using conjoint, and basically a product was broken down into its requisite parts, and customers were asked to trade off between those parts. Today, conjoint can be used for much more than just product research. It is a great tool to explore pricing and price elasticity. It can be used for product development research, how well the market will accept a new product, to understand the prioritization for different features, different brands, etc. Some of the things that conjoint is used for, first of all, for product design, it can be used to determine whether or how much new product features might impact customer preference, and help you understand how various product configurations might impact that preference. It can also measure the potential acceptance of a new product and how that product might impact or disrupt the market. From a price elasticity standpoint, conjoint can be used to determine how price changes can affect demand for holistic products, or how individual product features can impact what customers are willing to pay for a product. And then also looking at that from a new product development standpoint, you can understand, will this new feature on my product drive price higher for me? Brand value is actually something fairly new for conjoint, but it can be one of the types of conjoint can be used to help you determine the value of your brand and its impact on preference and price elasticity. And then finally, conjoint can be used to measure the importance of and customer preference for various product features. So going through a brief history lesson here about conjoint. In the 1970s, conjoint was developed, and it was literally cards that respondents would sort from best to worst, and then that information would be tabulated and used to develop what their preferences were and what different features what impact different features had on their preference. Then in the 1980s, around 1985, adaptive conjoint analysis was developed. This was a computer-based program. So in the 80s, 90s, even into the early 2000s, we often would use a phone recruit, mail out a literal floppy disk, wait for that floppy disk to come back, make several phone calls to respondents to get the floppy disk back, and then compile all of that data. It was a very cumbersome and extremely expensive process that is, with the advent of online research, become much easier and less expensive to execute. There are various advantages and disadvantages of adaptive conjoint, or ACA. When we look at it holistically, it does tend to minimize information overload for the respondents, and it can handle a large number of attributes, up to 30 different attributes. It does adapt using AI, so how the respondent answers each question will impact what they see for the following questions. So each of us would see a different series of questions or product combinations throughout the process. And it generates realistic trade-offs, so you wouldn't have ridiculous types of product combinations using ACA. The disadvantages, it must be administered online or via computer. The process can be a bit more abstract and challenging for respondents, and it's not ideal to measure price elasticity. And as other conjoint modules have been developed, ACA has actually almost gone to zero in usage. Only about 2% of conjoint exercises are actually ACA. Then in the 1990s, ChoiceBased Conjoint was introduced. This is a simplified, non-adaptive trade-off analysis. So it eliminates the rating and ranking. Instead, the respondents are shown a full profile of options, and they choose one over another in a series of questions. The advantages for ChoiceBased Conjoint, or CBC, are it is less abstract. It's more like a real-life product decision that customers may be making, and it can be administered via multiple mediums. It can be done online. If it's a fairly simple ChoiceBased Conjoint, it can be done in phone or in person, because you don't have a huge list of different attributes to read to these respondents. The disadvantages, it doesn't adapt to respondent choices, so you have very static questions, which makes it less appropriate for complex products and services. Then in the 2000s, a new type of conjoint was developed called MenuBased Conjoint. This isn't used all that frequently, but it is an advanced discrete choice modeling exercise that allows you to choose from multiple options on a menu. So you can choose a bundled product, you can choose a la carte. It gives you a lot more flexibility in how the products or the basket of products can be selected. Whereas the other types of conjoint are a product only, menu-based conjoint gives you the option of having a basket of products from which respondents can select. Again, the advantages gives you greater customization of the products and the attributes, and provides a more realistic product configuration for the respondents. It also gives you a more precise understanding of price sensitivity. From a disadvantage standpoint, it's much more complicated to program and execute than other conjoint methodologies, and it's really not appropriate for a more simplistic product or service. Around 2010, adaptive choice-based conjoint was developed, and this has really been designed to mimic the decision process for complex products and services. ACBC combines kind of the best aspects of both the adaptive conjoint and the choice-based conjoint. And it works in a series of steps, which we'll talk about a little bit later here, where the respondent can build their own preferred product. Then they go through a screening series of questions, and then finalize with some choice tasks that look very similar to what you would see in a choice-based conjoint. The advantages for ACBC are it's more realistic and very engaging for the respondents, and it captures more information at each individual attribute and level, so allows for more customized and accurate analysis on the back end. It does take longer to administer an ACBC from both a programming, the upfront work that must be done to develop the attributes and levels, and it's not ideal for simple products with only a few attributes. In fact, we recently had a project that we designed as an ACBC for a client and ended up not using that. We were hoping to understand brand value, but the product was so simplistic that we had to shift gears because it did not work well with the ACBC. And as with adaptive conjoint and the menu-based conjoint, it must be administered online or via computer. And then finally, talking about MacDiff. Now, this is not a true conjoint exercise, but it is an easy-to-use approach to obtain a rank order of attribute importance and or preference for product attributes, benefit statements, product features, different brands. Essentially, the respondents are asked a series of questions multiple times. If we're talking about importance, it would be which of the following is most important or your first choice, and which of the following is least important. And they will go through that a number of times depending on how long the list of attributes or benefit statements is. From an advantage standpoint, we've all had projects where everything is important. When we ask on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 7, how important is X? And everything is important. So this methodology eliminates that. It's impossible to give a straight line response because you're only answering what's best and what's least. And it provides an alternative route to prioritize a long list of attributes. From a disadvantage standpoint, it may take longer to administer than scaled response questions. If we have a list of 20 attributes and they're providing a 1 to 7 rating for each of those attributes, you can go relatively quickly, whereas that same list of 20 attributes will require about 15 different screens if we show 4 attributes per screen. So with all these different choices, which conjoint should you use? And unfortunately, the simple answer to that question is it depends. There are several other questions that need to be asked in order to ascertain what the best conjoint methodology is. So what is your subject matter? What is your objective? Are you trying to better understand your brand? Are you looking at existing products and what drives preference? Are you developing new products? Do you need insights into pricing? All of those questions will lead to a path that says this is the best type of conjoint for your application. The complexity of the product or service also will drive you to one of the choices. How many attributes are we talking about? Are there 5 attributes? Are there 15 attributes? Each of those will lead you to a different option. What is my respondent base and how many of them exist? So that will drive you to the methodology. So if we have a universe, or a small universe where only 100 companies and maybe 200 people would have insights into this specific product, then you may have to go via phone, because online might not work that well, which leads you to the CBC option. If you have a large universe of potential respondents, it opens up more options to you. And then here, and when you get this, you'll see kind of a traffic light of what is best for what, and as you ask and answer the questions on the previous page, it will point you to, this is probably the best solution for this particular objective. So key success factors as you're thinking about doing a conjoint project. First of all, on the do side, do know your research objectives and what you want the conjoint to accomplish. When you are designing the conjoint, have specific and measurable attributes. Things like brand, price, lead time, cycle time, physical size, all of those are measurable and would have different levels based on your product and your competitors' products. Make sure that you allow adequate time for attribute definition and survey development. Sometimes conjoint surveys can take longer to develop. There's more back and forth between the client, the supplier, and really making sure that we have kind of the full universe of potential competitive features and options represented within the list of attributes. We often recommend for conjoint projects that we do some pre-survey qualitative interviews to fully define the attributes and levels prior to designing the actual conjoint. And then finally, on the back end, expect multiple iterations of analysis. In fact, the more involved you as the client are, the better the outcome will be from an analysis standpoint. For your don'ts, when you're doing a conjoint, you don't want to leave attributes open for interpretation or have attributes with relative values. The most common one here is folks want to have some measure of quality, and quality in and of itself is not a good attribute. High quality, low quality, it's very difficult to get a specific measurable quality metric. It would be something other than quality. We also recommend for conjoint that you don't try to include too many other questions in the balance of the survey. Conjoint can take several minutes to complete, and that can often result in respondent fatigue during other questions. Also, don't assume too much. Conjoint provides share of preference, not market share. I often refer to it as market share in a vacuum, but it doesn't take into account things like competitive response, advertising, advertised specials, things along those lines. So it can't take the entire world into account. It's really a market share in a vacuum. And then finally, don't apply conjoint for all applications. Even when you think you have a conjoint question, there may be a better solution than conjoint. There may be, if you're doing price elasticity, it may be more beneficial to use a traditional Van Westendorp than to try and force it into a conjoint. So the first case study that we're going to talk about is ChoiceBased Conjoint. So just a quick reminder, ChoiceBased Conjoint is the most popular conjoint module. In fact, when people generically talk about conjoint, they're most likely talking about ChoiceBased Conjoint because it offers a more simplistic way to gauge respondent interest in the various product attributes, brands, etc. And then respondents are shown a series of screens with set product configurations similar to that shown on the screen here. So how can this help you? It's less abstract and it simulates real-world buying decisions. It can be conducted online, in person, or via phone. As we said earlier, your success using in-person or phone interviews will really depend on the number of attributes, and it often takes less time than an adaptive conjoint or ACBC, which allows you to use more ancillary questioning around the conjoint. And then we have a case study here. We did some research, consumer research, that the manufacturer was looking at TV thickness and bezel width, and it wanted to determine if consumers would pay more for an ultra-thin TV so they could determine a go-no-go decision regarding their future product development. So we did 200 online consumer interviews. We used ChoiceBased Conjoint. And through the ChoiceBased Conjoint, we also did a qualitative section up front to help us design that conjoint. We determined that TV thickness, frame width, and bezel width all have a significant impact on consumer preference. So much so that they preferred the thinner TV up until a point where the thinner TV, the thinner bezel, had a price premium that was 33% higher than a thicker TV. And also pairing that thin TV with the most preferred brand yielded even higher price premiums. So based on this research, the decision was made to move forward with the development of the ultra-thin TV. For the ACBC, this one is definitely more complex and has multiple sections to the conjoint itself. So as I said, there's a build your own, then there's a screening process where certain attributes, maybe they have, it must have this or it can never have that. Certain attributes become more or less important through this screening process, and then they go through a series of choice tasks. So the build your own literally takes each attribute and each level within each attribute and asks the respondent to select one. This can be done with or without dynamic pricing. So the example here on your screen shows dynamic pricing such that each level can either add a premium or reduce the price depending on what the attribute or level might be. So from a base price of $7,000, I could have a Yamaha, but it's going to increase that base price to $15,000. Then based on this build your own exercise, the respondents go through a screening exercise to understand, they will be shown a series of product combinations and understand if it works for them or it doesn't work for them. And the program will interpret their answers and ask them additional questions. We've noticed that you're always selecting a piano that is Yamaha brand. Is that a must-have? Yes, no. We notice that you never select something with round legs. Is that a never have? Yes, no. And then finally, it goes through the choice tasks, similar to a choice-based conjoint, where they will be asked which of these is the best option. This process keeps the respondents more engaged. It allows for more specific understanding of the individual features and the value of the individual features. In some cases, you can even do price elasticity on individual features versus traditional trade-off research or conjoint research, where you're typically looking at the value of the entire product. ACBC is able to include a greater number of attributes and works well with some of the small populations or small sample sizes common to B2B research. And then finally, I know we're running up on time here. We're going to get almost all the way through this. From a case study, just some kind of real world examples. We did some research for a global food service equipment manufacturer that was looking for insights into both its next generation product and the value of its brand. So we did an AC/BC exercise with 12 attributes, a total of 42 levels, so that we could prioritize all of those different features and determine for them, help them determine future product development sequencing. We did 500 total online interviews with food service professionals, both on the commercial side, so think restaurants, hotels, and the institutional side, K-12 schools, senior living, places like that. And it included both adaptive conjoint and, adaptive choice-based conjoint and scaled response questions. And ultimately, what we learned through this research was that food service professionals preferred the best features in the build your own exercise, but when they started to associate the price premium with those, that the preference declined significantly. Sincerely appreciate you taking the time out of your day to participate with us. If you have questions, you could contact me directly. You could go off through our website. I'm sure there's other portals that they can use.
Yeah, definitely. Like Ken said, thank you everyone for joining us. Another place that you can reach out to us if you have any questions is LinkedIn. We encourage you to follow the MarTech group on LinkedIn for future updates on webinars like this, or connect with Ken directly. I know he said he's happy to connect with anyone, so you can always reach out for conjoint advice. For your time, thank you everyone in the audience, and be sure to look out in your inboxes for the recording of the webinar. And since we did miss just like 1 or 2 case studies, feel free to reach out and ask for those remaining case studies or the slide deck.